Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our study of the book of Exodus, Deliverance and Constitution. I'm John Walker, and I am, along with others, sitting with Bruce Wadzeck, the minister of the Princeton Church of Christ. Bruce, where are we in our lesson on the book of Exodus?
Well, we got right to the heart of the book of Exodus last week, actually last 2 weeks, as we covered what we often call the 10 Commandments, but as we noted, the Hebrew Bible instead calls them the 10 words, where God spoke directly to the covenant people of Israel and outlined some core principles that should guide their lives. This week, we're going to move forward into what is usually called the Book of the Covenant, which goes for a couple of chapters and seeks to take those 10 commandments and put them into practical application in a variety of circumstances. Now, I warn you in advance that the way that ancient writers write is not how we write. They don't necessarily follow a chronological order. They don't necessarily put topics all together under the same subject, but you'll see a hodgepodge of different laws, some of them totally unrelated, and some of them you'll be talking about one topic, and then at the very last, it'll throw in some obscure law or rule, and don't let that distract you. Ancient people weren't distracted by it. Go read Hammurabi's Code, and which was written earlier than this Book of the Covenant, and you find a hodgepodge of different rules and regulations, and that was true throughout the ancient world. But also, before we get into the specifics of the laws, rules, and regulations, we need to keep in mind that their world is very different from our world in a number of ways. And I'll just mention a couple that'll be pertinent for tonight. Number one, they didn't have employers and employees. You couldn't go down to the local corporation and sign up for a job. There were no such things. And instead, what happened is if you worked outside of your own farm or home for someone else, you might be a day laborer. They get paid on a daily basis to do some short-term work. But if you worked more than that, you became what we would call an indentured servant, meaning you had to serve for a period of time, and you were paid a certain amount for doing that. And this obligated the person you're working for to provide room, board, clothing, etc., for you while you work for them. And we would say, well, why would somebody do that? Well, they would do that because they were in debt and they had no way to pay it off. And they would then agree to work for a short period of time for a certain person who had greater holdings than they did and needed help. And then they would pay off their debt and they would work that out by being an indentured servant. Many people that came to the United States didn't necessarily come from the scourge of the African slave trade. There were people from England and other places that couldn't afford to pay to get over here that became indentured servants to pay off the trip or to pay for a small piece of land, perhaps, once they got here. So this is indentured servitude has been something practiced up to more recently. It isn't at least in Western civilization, in practice today, although I'm sure it is somewhere. But my point is that we're talking about a totally different kind of servitude, as I think we'll see as we read the text. And then marriage was not the way it is today. People weren't romantically attracted and they decided to get married. It was all arranged marriages, and you had to pay a fee to the bride's family for the bride, which seems odd to us, but the economic realities of the ancient world required that, so that you lost the services of your daughter and you were compensated for that because she moves and works for another family. So that, plus when it comes to area of murder or injury to family members, the normal way that was handled in the world at this time, in the ancient world, was that members of that tribe or family took it upon them an obligation to seek out who harmed their family member and to bring retribution to that person. And of course, maybe they injured your relative and you decide to go over and kill them and two of their cousins, because again, if you're seeking vengeance, there's no limit to what you can do. And of course, then once you did that to their family, then their family would send people over to kill some in your family. And so it's a vicious cycle. And so we find in Hammurabi's code, they were trying to take these kind of things and let the state or the broader community get involved in it to stop that kind of behavior. And we find the same thing here, but you have to keep in mind some of the things they suggest are going to sound quite brutal to us. But when you consider the context of the times, when they say eye for eye, tooth for tooth, that sounds kind of terrible to us. We usually do purely money damages for most things, unless it's, of course, murder. And then we usually don't kill the person. We put them in incarcerated for a long period of time. But that's our justice system. That's where we are today. That's not where they were. And so I remind you, and when I see people that come in and criticize this law and that law, because today it doesn't sound very good. These are people without any common sense. God's not addressing the law of Moses to people living in New York State in 2021. He is addressing the people of Israel that had come out of Egyptian slavery 3,000 plus years ago in their cultural context. God didn't invent these things. God's trying to offer laws to regulate their already existing practices to try to make them more humane and try to make them more just. And so the fact that it doesn't get to where we are today is immaterial if you're considering compared to what country or people at that time had legal systems like our own? And the answer to that is none even close. The biblical law compared to its peers was much more humane and just than Hammurabi's code, which took into account whether you came from the upper class or the lower class of people in the town or civilization. And the biblical text doesn't do that. So again, we're seeing a different tack. It's a different time. And for us to understand this, we have to, some senses, put ourselves in their shoes or their sandals, shall we say, in a different world at a different time, and see what God was saying to them, offering a variety of examples of how being God's covenant people, how we were to act together in community with one another. And we can learn, of course, principles from this. Our law system goes back not only to the Ten Commandments, but to many of these other laws, and developed over time as circumstances and situations change. So let's pick up where we left off last week at the very end of chapter 20, which introduces the book of the covenant.
Verse 22. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites this, you have seen for yourselves that I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside me. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gold or gods of gold. Make an altar of earth for me and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, your sheep and goats and your cattle. Wherever I cause my name to be honored, I will come to you and bless you. If you make an altar of stones for me, do not build it with dressed stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it. And do not go up to my altar on steps, or your private parts may be exposed. Bruce, what does God require of the Israelites to worship?
So obviously they were going to offer sacrifices, which was the system of worship at that time. And God's concern is that, in worshiping him, they don't decide to build, out of gold or silver to show homage to God, some sort of idols to represent Yahweh, or certainly not to represent the other gods. Not to think, well, we'll worship Yahweh, but we'll also worship the other gods, which was pretty much the way all ancient people looked at things. Maybe our people have a God, or maybe there's a God of this particular region of the world, but there are other gods and spirits that need to be recognized too. So our God is just one among many, and you have to show regard, respect for all of them. Well, God was teaching his people there's only one creator God. There are gods, these are spiritual beings, and many of them in rebellion against the will of God, who were not to be worshiped. And so he warns them about making idols. And then he tells them, even if you make a place, an altar to sacrifice on, don't do it like the pagans do it. They develop an ornate thing. They'd raise it up on steps. We know this. We found one totally intact in the city of Megiddo. In Megiddo, in one part of Megiddo, they dug all the way down to the base rock through thousands of years of occupation and got down to the lowest level. And they found a carefully hewn out of stone altar. And so that would be your common way in the Canaanite religion. They would have these, they would carve the stones and make it ornate. And God says, no, I don't want some kind of altar like the Canaanites. You just build it out of dirt. And if you want stones, I want you to take natural stones and just fit them together around the outside of this dirt altar. Now, later, God will have them build a tabernacle and a portable altar and things like that. But at this point, he's just saying, I don't want you to be like the Canaanites, even in constructing a altar to worship on. And then again, this not exposing your private parts. In the Canaanite religion, in many of their ceremonies, they intentionally did that. This was kind of a raw sexuality that was involved in their worship. And so he's telling them, I don't want you to worship like the Canaanites do. There were fertility cults. Was what Baal and Ashtoreth were in Canaan. God is not a fertility God. God is the creator God of the universe, and he wants to be worshiped differently and distinctively from them. And so those are some of those instructions. And let's read some more in chapter 21.
These are the laws you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife, when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these 3 things, she is to go free without any payment of money. Bruce, what kind of service is this, and why would anyone want to live this way?
As I began to talk, I think earlier, in the ancient world, You didn't have a lot of options unless you happened to have a wealthy relative who wanted to help you through difficult times. What happened when the crops didn't come in one year? Well, you didn't even have the seed to plant a crop the next year. Well, where were you going to get the resources to do that? And sometimes you over a period of time, people lost land. They didn't have any land to plow to work on. And therefore, if they were going to survive, they had to find someone who needed a worker and would agree to hire them to be a servant. And notice it says when you buy a Hebrew servant, this would be like saying that in the NFL, they buy certain players. So they're paying money to this servant or to his family, or they're paying off their debts or something else like that. And so then this servant, who is a Hebrew, serves the person to whom purchased them, paid the money, and it puts here a limit on the number of years. It says no more than 6 years. In the 7th year, they must be released, which goes back, I think, to the idea of the Sabbath. We're going to see that later again. In the 7th year, things change, following the calendar of 7 days of creation. So in 7 years, there was supposed to be a freedom for people at the end of that. And so there were limits on the time that a person could serve. And then it starts getting into all the complexity. Well, if you were married when you went in, can you and your family leave when you're through? And she says, yes, you can. But what if you get married to someone who is a servant in the household there, who may owe further service than you do, or may have been a permanent servant in the house? Well, what do you do then? So he tries to go into all the circumstances and try to provide justice for the servant and something reasonable compensation to the landlord who was hiring the different people to do their service. And so it just offers many very practical examples. And then when a man sells his daughter, now that sounds really bad. And again, I think all it's talking about in context is that some person, perhaps very poverty stricken, perhaps couldn't afford to support his daughter, but he's selling her with a bride price to be a servant and wife in someone else's family, maybe a second wife or not, or maybe for the son of the person who is paying her bride price. So I think when you understand in the ancient world, you always paid money if you were going to marry somebody, and it was always an arranged situation. And so the father arranges for this. I think that's what this was, a form of a marriage. And then it goes on to say, if he has another wife, he can't just neglect her because he's moved on to someone else, but he must take care of her. And if he doesn't, then she goes free. She has no obligation to him if he does not provide some essentials for her existence. So just very practical, getting down to the nitty gritty of how life was lived in the several thousand years ago in the Middle East.
So pick up at verse 12. Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it is not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, they are to flee to a place I will designate. But if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. If people quarrel and one person hits another with a stone or with their fist and the victim does not die but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held liable if the other can get up and walk around outside with a staff. However, if the guilty party must pay the injured person for any loss of time and see that the victim is completely healed. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. Bruce, will you share a little bit about these various consequences of killing or injuring a person?
As I said, the natural way that things got solved in the ancient world was that your family sought retribution if something happened to you. If you were murdered, injured, or a woman was pregnant and a scuffle took place and she was harmed and the baby came out prematurely. Um, they, they didn't go to court. There wasn't typically a court situation you could use. And so here, God is trying to establish for his people a orderly and practical way to deal with all of these circumstances. Now, notice, first of all, if somebody is a intentional murderer of someone else, they have forfeited their right to live on the earth. And he tells them, you know, they have forfeited their life. Take it. No ifs, ands, and buts. However, if it wasn't intentional, he says, and we recognize the difference between intentional murder and unintentional. When somebody wasn't, maybe somebody's driving too fast and they hit somebody, they weren't trying to kill somebody, but they did kill somebody. So it's unintentional. And so we don't expect as severe a consequence for that as for somebody who willfully and deliberately seeks to kill someone else. And it says those people are to be put to death. But the others can seek refuge. And later on, he'll talk about the refuge cities that people want to go to, and they can plead their case to an independent group of elders to decide their case. And so it recognizes that kind of distinction that we do today in our own law. And then, of course, severe consequences with those that attack their parents, curse their parents. We noted that earlier. And then notice that kidnapping, very severe penalty. I mean, when you think about it, that's what happened to the slave trade. They went over and kidnapped people in Africa and brought them involuntarily across an ocean where they had no chances of getting free. They were totally disoriented and were then put in terrible circumstances without any choice to that, and with no limits on that. And so that would be involved with kidnapping. And the Bible takes a very dim view of that. And again, if people are trying to kidnap other people, they must be dealt with very severely because you can't tolerate that kind of behavior in a community. Then he goes on, what about if people are quarreling and squabbling with one another and somebody is injured in that attack? Well, you have to consider how severe was that injury, and they must be compensated for that based on the injury. And what's interesting, it may seem odd to us, but in most of Hammurabi's code, nothing was said about servants or slaves. They have no recourse if they were injured in any way by whoever was their master. That was just their tough luck. But here he shows compassion and concern for the servant who might be abused or mistreated by the person that he is serving. So that's different than most of the ancient laws of that day. And then talked about a woman that might get struck in a squabble and she loses her child, and she's to be compensated for the life both of the child and her own, I think. If the baby dies, there are severe consequences, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, as it said. And then he says, if you injure your servant, male or female, you have to let them go. You can't keep them anymore if you severely injured them, as damage their vision of one eye or knock out one of their teeth. And so, again, getting down to the nitty gritty of the ancient world, their circumstances different from our own. But what we see in all this is God seeking to call for justice, not for vengeance, in the world that he wanted his covenant people to create.
Thank you, Bruce. Let's continue on with verse 28. If a bull gores a man or woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten. But the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring, and the owner has been warned but has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or woman, the bull is to be stoned, and its owner also is to be put to death. However, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or daughter. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull is to be stoned to death. If anyone uncovers a pit and digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the one who opened the pit must pay the owner for the loss and take the dead animal in exchange. If anyone's bull injures someone else's bull and it dies, the two parties are to sell the live one and divide both the money and the dead animal equally. However, if it was known that the bull had the habit of goring, yet the owner did not keep it penned up, the owner must pay animal for animal and take the dead animal in exchange. Bruce, what role do animals play in Israelite society?
Well, again, it was an agrarian society. We're talking probably 95% of people were involved directly and indirectly in agriculture of some kind, either on their land or on the land of someone else. And the wealth of people at that time had to do with the land that they owned, and then with any animals that they owned. And only thirdary did it have to do with silver or gold. Theirs was not a society that operated primarily off of currency or coins. They operate primarily on a barter type system, and like we find indentured servitude and other means. And so, these animals were your nest egg. They were your economic asset. And so if one of them got killed, destroyed, if somebody else's negligence led to that, they had to compensate you for that. And then what if you have a bull? They were very valuable, and they gored somebody else, they harmed somebody else. Well, you had to compensate those people. However, if that particular bull had a history of goring people and you didn't take care of the animal, so he gored somebody else, well, your life could be taken along with the animals. Again, animals, once they attack human beings, usually need to be put to death because they've now become dangerous. They've discovered they can attack and kill human beings. But again, it's put in their context, if you don't take care of your animals and you harm others, there are going to be severe consequences for that. And then, of course, if you lost a slave, it's not just good enough that something happens to you, but you need to pay to compensate the person for the fact that you have eliminated the service and the value to the person whom they owed that. So again, it provides some compensation possibilities as well. And then if your animal damages other animals, or if you dig a pit and you don't properly protect it, and animals are injured, all these things show that you are irresponsible, and therefore there are consequences. If it's unintentional, then of course it's a less penalty than if it's clear lack of proper care on your part. And so that's what he's saying. And let's pick up at chapter 22 and look at what else.
Whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay 5 head of cattle, pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. Anyone who steals must certainly make restitution, but if they have nothing, they must be sold to pay for their theft. If the stolen animal is found alive in their possession, whether ox or donkey or sheep, they must pay back double. If anyone grazes their livestock in a field or vineyard and lets them stray and they graze in someone else's field, the offender must make restitution from the best of their own field or vineyard. If a fire breaks out and spreads into the thorn bushes so that it burns shocks of grain or standing grain or the whole field, the one who started the fire must make restitution. If anyone gives a neighbor silver or goods for safekeeping and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if caught, must pay back double. But if the thief is not found, the owner of the house must appear before the judges, and they must determine whether the owner of the house has laid hands on the other person's property. In all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, or any other lost property about which somebody says, "This is mine," both parties are to bring their cases before the judges. The one whom the judges declare guilty must pay back double to the other. If anyone gives a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to their neighbor for safekeeping, and it dies, or is injured, or is taken away while no one is looking, the issue between them will be settled by the taking of an oath before the Lord that the neighbor did not lay hands on the other person's property. The owner is to accept this, and no restitution is required. But if the animal was stolen from the neighbor, restitution must be made to the owner. If it was torn to pieces by a wild animal, the neighbor shall bring in the remains as evidence and shall not be required to pay for the torn animal. If anyone borrows an animal from their neighbor and it is injured or dies while the owner is not present, they must make restitution. But if the owner is with the animal, the borrower will not have to pay. If the animal was hired, the money paid for the hire covers the loss. Bruce, how is the command, "You shall not steal," worked out here?
So it considers a variety of types of circumstances that might occur that could be considered stealing, and I think addresses them specifically. You know, if you are caught stealing, you have to pay back so many bulls for each one stolen. And most of the cases, it's double restitution for whatever you have taken. If it could be proven that you stole this animal or you're in possession of an animal that you didn't have a right to. And then he deals with what if you're cooking and a fire starts and it burns another person's field. Well, you have to compensate them. You have to give them restitution for that. So however you might injure others, instead of seeking out vengeance and fighting one another and killing one another, as many ancient people did, they were to go before the judiciary of their day, which usually had to do with the priest. Matter of fact, when it says before the judges in our translation, NIV, literally that says going before God. And so what it's suggesting is they would go to the tabernacle, wherever the priests were, others, and they would serve as judges to determine what was right and what was wrong in a given circumstances. So it's the beginning of a judicial system for them. And then, if you have any of their silver or other things, and it's found that this is not your property, you have to pay restitution. So it's trying to get them away from an angry response, just kill your neighbor. Matter of fact, it even says if somebody's stealing something from you and it's the middle of the night when it's dark and you can't see, and you try to defend yourself in your house and you happen to kill the person, then you're not responsible. But if it's daylight, you can see who this is, you don't have the right to kill them. You can call out the rest of the people in the village and everyone else, and you know who they are, and you can see that they pay restitution. And so again, it's trying to get away from the vengeance that was so often taken with these sort of things. And then he tells them, what happens if you are supposed to be taking care of an animal and then something happens to them? Well, again, if you didn't maliciously do this and you were giving reasonable care, you could go before the Lord and confess an oath that you did the right thing. And if God didn't strike you dead, then your neighbor was to take your word on that. And so it's just considering all kinds of possibilities where you borrow things, you're entrusted with things, or people actually steal things. What are the consequences if something bad happens in that regard? And so there are a lot of different practical applications of stealing related ideas. And then we'll pick up where verse 16.
If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must still pay the bride price for virgins. Do not allow a sorceress to live. Anyone who has sexual relations with an animal is to be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. Do not hold back offerings from their granaries or your vats. You must give me the firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your cattle and your sheep. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days, but give them to me on the 8th day. You are to be my holy people. So do not eat the meat of an animal torn by wild beasts. Throw it to the dogs. Bruce, what social responsibilities are dealt with here?
Well, some very important ones are, the most vulnerable people in the ancient world were obviously the poor. If they didn't own any land, their family didn't have any land, they didn't have family that had resources, they were the poor of the land. And they were really in a terrible situation, and they could obviously be taken advantage of. Widows, once your husband died, and a lot of that happened from disease and war, you were in a vulnerable position too, because you couldn't necessarily go back to your family. Perhaps your parents were dead and there was really nobody to go to. And they could be taken advantage of too. And orphans, when again, parents died and left them alone in the world, they could be taken advantage of too. And so the Lord shows great concern for these most vulnerable citizens of the future Israel. And God reminds them, look, I'm paying attention. Even if no one else holds you to account, I'll hold you account if you abuse these most vulnerable in society. And then he gives an interesting here, if a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged. So almost every other circumstance is considered elsewhere in the Bible. But this is not a rape. Rape is considered later in the book of Deuteronomy, but this is a man seduces. So there's some willingness, but a young woman is deceived in the process of it. And so what are the consequences of that? Well, when you've ruined the virginity of a young girl at that time, she was not able to receive a full bride price. You had destroyed her. She might not even find someone to marry. So she was in terrible straits. And so he said, okay, if you did that, the one who did that has to pay the bride price and then take her as a wife, because others may not be willing to take her as a wife. But if the father says, no, I don't want my daughter with him, he still has to pay the bride price to the father. So it's considering circumstances beyond the normal adultery circumstances where somebody is married. Adultery in Israel had to do with people who were married or pledged to be married. Outside of that, that was not considered adultery. It was considered to be morally wrong, but it wasn't considered to be adultery. And so it's giving specific cases and specific consequences. And again, of course, those who blaspheme God or curse the rulers of your people, you're not to tolerate that. And don't get in the habit of delaying giving your offerings to God that is owed to God. And he reminds them the first fruits, the firstborn of your animals is to be a gift to God, even your child. And we find out later that the way they redeem their child, they can give your child like Samuel was given to serve in the temple, or you can redeem your child by a sacrificial offering of an animal, we find out later on. But all this is reminding you that all your blessings come from God. More children, the firstborn, if you're going to have many more, it comes from God's blessing. If you're going to have lots of animals and they're going to procreate and you're going to make you a prosperous person, that's a blessing from God. So you remember that and acknowledge that by giving the firstborn to the Lord. Then he continues, chapter 23.
We're into 23. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu."
23, I think we're in the wrong place. Chapter 23, verse 1.
Yeah, you know what? You are right there. Got a little ahead of myself there. Went to 24. Let's go to 23, verse 1. Do not spread false reports. Do not help a guilty person by being a malicious witness. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd, and do not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit. If you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you fallen down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help with it. Do not deny justice to your poor people in their lawsuits. Have nothing to do with a false charge, and do not put an innocent or honest person to death, for I will not acquit the guilty. Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see and twists the words of the innocent. Do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt. How is the command to not bear false witness developed in this section, Bruce?
As we noted, that command is not just a generic command against lying, although the Bible would be opposed to lying. Instead, it refers to testimony given in a trial-like circumstance. And so here he elucidates it by, don't spread false reports about people. Do not help a guilty person by being a malicious witness. Don't try to protect people by lying. Don't go along with the crowd, even though the crowd wants you to change your testimony or make it conform to what they want the outcome to be. Don't pervert justice by doing that, but tell the truth. Don't show favoritism on one hand, he says, to a poor person. We don't think of that as a possibility, but a judge could show favoritism to the poor or to the rich. And a little later, he says, do not deny justice to poor people in their lawsuits. So don't favor the rich or others. And if you come across your enemy, somebody you really hate, and they're in a terrible circumstance, don't just say, well, I just left them there. I didn't do it to them. And so, they were under a crushing load and died. I didn't help them, but, I don't have to help them. They got themselves that mess, let them get out. He says, no, that's no excuse. You're to help them. And don't accept bribes, that pervert justice. And also make sure that foreigners that live among you are treated with justice too. And again, that's interesting because in the Hammurabi's codes and all that, we have no mention at all of foreigners, people that are not citizens. All the laws that are addressed by other ancient codes deal with only their own citizens. And if you're not a citizen, you kind of forfeit the benefits of the law. And so here, God is reminding his covenant people, remember you were a foreigner in Egypt. Did you want to be treated right there? You weren't treated right during some of your stay there. Are you going to turn around and treat those who are strangers or foreigners in your land the way you were treated in Egypt? And he forbade them to do that. They also must receive justice, just like every other person is to receive justice. And then he goes on to some religious principles, Sabbath laws and festivals. This will wrap us up for tonight.
Verse 10, for 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest the crop. But during the 7th year, let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. Be careful to do everything I have said to you. Do not invoke the names of other gods. Do not let them be heard on your lips. 3 times a year you are to celebrate a festival to me. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread. For 7 days eat bread made without yeast, as I commanded you. Do this at the appointed time in the month of Aviv, for in that month you came out of Egypt. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. Celebrate the festival of harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in your field. Celebrate the festival of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in your crops from the field. 3 times a year, all the men are to appear before the sovereign Lord. Do not offer the blood of a sacrifice to me, along with anything containing yeast. The fat of my festival offerings must not be kept until the morning. Bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Bruce, what do we learn about the Sabbath and Israelites' festivals here?
Just bring out one interesting point. Notice out of nowhere at the end, he says, do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Out of nowhere. And no one really knows exactly what this is trying to get at, although there's speculation. The way Jews interpret it, Orthodox Jews, is you're not to cook any dairy product with a meat. And so that's how they interpret the significance of that. But let's get back to the Sabbath. Notice it takes the Sabbath principle and says your land needs rest too. Every 7th year, rest it. And we know that if you work any kind of land, you'll deplete the minerals and resources in the land. And the way the rabbis said they did this is it's not that a person can afford to, have crop 6 years and have no crop the seventh, but they would take a part of their land and say 1/7 of their land 1 year they let alone, and then the next year another 1/7. And so ultimately, over a 7-year period, all of their land would rest 1 year, but they would have crops that were coming in. But again, it's the Sabbath principle of rest. Land needs rest as well. And then he reminds them again of the Sabbath principle. They and their slaves and others are to be given rest on the seventh day, the Sabbath. Don't, again, call the names of other gods. And then he gives them the three main festivals that all Jews are required to participate in. And these are agricultural events. The very first one he calls one of unleavened bread. That's at the very beginning of the harvest season. And that's also the Passover occurs at the very end of the unleavened bread. And then 50 days later, you have what we call Pentecost. They call it a little bit different here. What they call it the Festival of Harvest with the first fruits. And so by 50 days later, you'd finished one whole crop, begun another crop harvesting. And so these were festivals celebrated in conjunction with harvest is beginning and concluding. And the last one was the ingathering, later called the Festival of Booths, where they camped outdoors during this final harvest of the year, which occurred usually in October. And this was the last festival. They finished their agriculture. Now they plant for a new year, and they would rest until later when they began to harvest back again, the March, April timeframe of the next year. So these were festivals that had to do with the agricultural seasonality of life in the ancient world. And so God designed specific things they were to do and to remember on these special occasions. And then he just offers, very practical advice, things that are going to be dealt with elsewhere. The fat of the animal is supposed to be given to the Lord, not taken for oneself, because you're supposed to give your best to the Lord, the first fruits, the best animals, etc. He reminds them of their obligation to God. If they want to be blessed in this land that God is going to give them, they have to treat God with respect. They have to treat their land with respect. They have to treat one another with respect and see that justice is done in their midst. As we wrap up today, I'm just reminded of Jesus was asked about, when you read a lot of commands like we have tonight, I'm reminded Jesus was asked what's the most important command in Matthew chapter 22.
Verse 36, Teacher, which is the greatest command in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest command. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments.
Jesus had a profound way of summing up hundreds and hundreds of laws. The number of laws in the Old Testament are, depending on whether you consider certain ones slightly different laws or repetitions, you have 613, 620 something laws. And that's a lot of laws. But Jesus reminds us that God gives us summary concepts in the book of Deuteronomy. The essence of worship to God and Sabbath keeping is to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We're to love God in response to his gracious love of us. And the second is to love people, to love our neighbor. That's a quote taken out of Leviticus chapter 19. And so it was right there in the law, but oftentimes they got obscured by looking for one law more important than this one. And so he reminds that there's nothing greater in the old covenant than love. the love God has for us, the love he had for his covenant people, Israel, and therefore their responsibility to love God totally in return. And God calls on, as all these laws are mostly about, loving our neighbor, treating our neighbor with respect, justice, treating foreigners and others with respect and kindness, because we're all made in the image of God and must be treated with respect. So even in the Old Testament, the covenant is a covenant of grace for the people of Israel. And the ultimate thing they can do, there may be a variety of ways, and the Old Testament helps them to understand what love means in a variety of contexts, both in relationship with God and in relationship with their neighbor. But it's still fundamentally about love. And we need to remember that it's not just the new covenant, it was the old covenant too, was supposed to be about grace and love. Not that people took it always that way, just like people don't take the new covenant and appreciate grace or emphasize love. You can legalize any kind of spiritual system, but the essence of what causes the law to hang together and make sense is it's dealing with two distinct things: loving God and loving our neighbor. And Jesus, as always, helps us make sense of what could be overwhelming confusion about the details, and instead get to the heart of the matter. I pray that we can be people that love God and love people as God wants us to. John, would you close us out?
Father, we thank you for another amazing lesson taught by your servant Bruce. We thank you for his ability to make clear your holy and divine word, that we might be equipped to walk through life and share the good news of Jesus Christ with others. Lord, we are so grateful for your word, guidance, its guiding power. And Father, we pray that we continue to love you with all of who we are, that we love our fellow man the way you've loved us, and remember the grace that we are provided every day, and extend that in honor of you. Let us always be image bearers of your Son, Jesus, for it is in his name we ask this prayer and all blessings. Amen.